Love it. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. This is an Ice Age Floods lecture, and this is a case study on something called Moses Coulee. It's a beautiful, large canyon in central Washington. How many people have been to Moses Coulee? Okay, almost everybody. That is so exciting. And if you have not been to Moses Coulee, it's more than an hour drive, but it's an easy hour and 20 minutes from here. And you drive right up Moses Coulee, and you know, without even any geology background, you know it's a special place. You know, you can just feel that it's a special place. Culturally, people have been in there for thousands of years. There's farm families in that coulee today. It's not a national park. It's not a state park. It's mostly private land in the floor of the coulee. But there is incredible antiquity to Moses Coulee. First point, longer and older history than the Ice Age. The Ice Age goes back 2.6 million years ago, and Moses Coulee goes back at least 10 million years. But I got to choose my words carefully. I don't mean the shape of Moses Coulee as it is today goes back 10 million years, but there is clearly a pre-Ice Age history with a Moses River Valley. And I want to make sure that you can see the evidence for that. And it's not rocket science. You can drive up Moses Coulee tomorrow morning and you can see the evidence that this is a pre-Ice Age valley that has been converted into its present form by some Ice Age floods. But I'm holding a piece of paper up here. In fact, it's, I don't know, let me count. 1, 2, 3. 3 pieces of paper, double-sided, no big deal, stapled. And it's a brand new paper that was published just a few days ago. A brand new paper. And this lecture is built around that brand new paper. And we're going to celebrate that brand new paper. And it's a risky, bold paper asking our question tonight. Was Moses Coulee carved largely by subglacial floods from directly underneath the Canada ice sheet that was immediately north of Moses Coulee? That has not been the company line for the creation and the formation and the carving of Moses Coulee. But this new paper is saying that, and we'll see what kind of impact, what kind of conversation this brand new paper tells. Okay, I want to use the chalkboards a bunch tonight, and there's no time like the present. Let's go. We're going to ignore this one and this one for now, although if you're a decent map reader, you've already figured out that that's Moses Coulee right there. And this is Wenatchee, Washington, nearby. And here's Wenatchee, Washington, and here's Moses Coulee. And here's Wenatchee, Washington, and here's Moses Coulee. Different scales. Let's start here. Ellensburg, where this auditorium is right here. Moses Coulee is here. And for the last 50 years, since about 1970, Moses Coulee has been on everybody's radar in Ice Age Floods geology papers. And it's been a major question mark, a major puzzle, an enigma. What's up with Moses Coulee? Why does it look like this? So if you are unfamiliar with the Ice Age flood story, this is the Spokane River coming through downtown Spokane, Washington. Here's Seattle, Washington. There's Ellensburg. And this is the Spokane River that then merges with the Columbia River coming from the north. This is the Columbia River Valley, past Chelan, past Wenatchee, the Columbia River heading towards Wallula Gap, the Columbia River flowing past Portland and to the Pacific Ocean. Good. The Grand Coulee, the Telford Crab Creek flood pathway, and the Cheney Palouse are connected with each other and also collected at their heads and at their foots with major river valleys. I can even add some other cross channels in here if you like. Everybody's connected with each other with the Ice Age floods except for Moses Coulee, the way that it looks on this map. It's not like I got sidetracked and started talking to somebody before the lecture. It freaking looks like that. It just stops. And the Waterville Plateau is the no man's land between Moses Coulee, again, this is a huge canyon, and the Columbia River far to the north. So the question is, how are you going to get Missoula floodwater into Moses Coulee? Missoula, Montana is off here to the right, is off here to the east. Missoula, Glacial Lake Missoula, and the Missoula floods start at truly Missoula, Montana. And we need to get that water into Moses Coulee. Say the scientific papers for the last 50 years. It's a puzzle. How are we going to do that? How are we going to get this Missoula floodwater 20,000 years ago into Moses Coulee to carve it, to convert it from a Moses River valley into a beautiful big box-shaped Moses Coulee? Well, that question and that puzzle and that enigma assumes a couple of things. One, it assumes it has to be Glacial Lake Missoula that's the source of the floods that are carving Moses Coulee. And two, the assumption is that carving happened 20,000 years ago, tied to the marine isotope stage 2. But this is your third night in a row for many of you, and we have a color scheme going. Did you like that? I paused for dramatic effect, and it all got real quiet. Now we can speed it up again. I said I'm using the chalkboard. I haven't used a stick of chalk yet. I've been investigating with you over the past year and a half. I have been sharing with you in the past 2 nights J. Harlan Bretz's original idea 100 years ago of something called a Spokane flood, which is far older than the Missoula floods that we all know. So Red, if you're new to us tonight and new to this lecture, stumbling onto it on YouTube, Red tonight is 20,000 years ago. Red tonight is the time of the Glacial Lake Missoula floods. And we are importing Ice Age flood water from 2 states away and getting it into each of these flood channels. But how are we going to get it into Moses Coulee? There's this other story that appears to be a bigger and older story. Is it one colossal flood as Brett's thought originally, or is it something different? Are there multiple major floods in the very old days of the Ice Age? I don't think we're worried about the old dates. What we want to emphasize before we do new stuff right tonight is that the Missoula floods are a pro-glacial story. And the water is coming from Montana, and it's skirting around the front of the Canadian ice sheet. The Spokane flood, as J. Harlan Bretz proposed it 100 years ago, is not a pro-glacial story, but it's a subglacial flood story. Blue, 150,000 years ago, question mark, blue. This is the Spokane ice sheet over the city of Spokane. Blue. These are trenches. These are narrow, linear, north-south valleys that we have today. What is this one? This is the frickin' Okanagan. Drive up US 97, cross the border. It's still, I think, called 97. The only difference is there's like a different vowel between their Okanagan and our Okanagan, right? But it is a major trench. We don't call it the Okanagan Trench, but it may as well be. It's just as dramatic on Google Earth as the Rocky Mountain Trench or the Purcell Trench. What is Brett saying 100 years ago? He's saying we have ice sheet over this country, we have the ice sheet over northern Washington. The Spokane ice sheet proposing the Spokane flood is a subglacial story, and while the ice is there, water is coming like a fire hose out from the front of the Spokane ice sheet in multiple places. The actual fire hoses where the waters are coming out from underneath the ice, 150,000 years ago, question mark, those fire hoses are laid in the trenches. They're laid right in the gutters. It's not an accident where the fire hoses are sending water out from the bottom. And where's Moses Coulee? It's lined up with the Okanagan Trench. So to assume, without even thinking much about it, that the Ice Age floodwater carving Moses Coulee is Missoula floodwater, that's a strange assumption to some of us who are familiar with this older story put together by J. Harlan Bretz. And you're also trying to get water from 2 states away that's going against the lay of the land. Everything is corrugated. Everything is corrugated north-south. Even when we melt each of these ice sheets, where's that water going to go? It's going to go to Washington. It's going to come to us. Basically, the Missoula flood story is assuming there is no water crossing the borders, or minor amounts of water crossing the border. But we are now seeing that Moses Coulee not only is an Ice Age flood story, but this new paper proposes that most, maybe all, of the carving of Moses Coulee is not Missoula water, not Missoula flood water, and instead is Canadian water coming right down the guts. Very good. Let's add some detail to that, but I'm happy with getting that message through, and I can feel how you're absorbing this and playing with it. Thank you. All that's happening in the silence, but I can feel it. I appreciate it. The new paper is based on some brand new features. And I was going to use red, and then I thought I was going to use blue, but I don't want to use either. I don't want to say the age. First of all, I just want to say that for the first time, we have a connection between Moses Coulee and a source of the water. You remember the beginning of this lecture, not that few minutes ago. Everything else is connected to a potential source of the water, but this thing's out here by itself. It's isolated. What is the new documented set of channels that proves a connection? It looks like this. On the Waterville Plateau are a beautiful set of radial channels. They're not parallel to each other. They fan out. And they were unrecognized before just a few years ago. We now have excellent imagery from space. LIDAR, Google Earth, other kinds of DEMs. And for the first time on the Waterville Plateau, amongst all those dryland wheat fields, they're not huge canyons, but there's a series of channels that even continue north of the Columbia River. You'll see some beautiful maps and illustrations in just a bit. This is the Omak Plateau. This is the Waterville Plateau. These new channels, new, and that they've been documented for the first time in this brand new paper, are all collectively talking about subglacial tunnel channels. And now if we do want red ice, the Withrow Moraine, which marks the furthest, the south extent of the advance of the ice 20,000 years ago, those channels on the Waterville and Omak Plateau abruptly stop right where the terminal moraine, the Withrow Moraine, is on the Waterville Plateau. And what's directly south of it? The frickin' Moses Coulee, man. When the ice was here, subglacial channels were feeding water to Moses Coulee. That's a much more pleasing solution, if you ask me, than trying to get water to come from Montana. Now, is it impossible to still have Missoula water get in there? I don't think it's impossible, but I think an easier solution, especially with these new tunnel channels, make a lot of sense. But maybe I want to get rid of red. And maybe I want to emphasize the fact that what if we're willing to at least entertain that? Is it possible those tunnel channels, if we buy the idea of subglacial flow, is it possible that those newly documented tunnel channels are blue instead of red? And is it possible those channels are tied to the Spokane flood or some sort of much older flood that's carving Moses Coulee? So the reds and the blues are Ice Age color schemes that we've been using all three of these lectures. That's clearly up here in this top chapter. Younger than 2.6 million years ago. I think the last thing I want to do with these boards before I go over there is to say, okay, if this is truly what it looked like earlier than 20,000 years ago, maybe hundreds of thousands of years earlier than 20,000 years ago, when we bring the red ice in, we're covering up everything. And we're only seeing a little bit of the older, bigger blue story at our surface. So is it an accident or is it surprising that we're having a hard time addressing the fact that there are older generations of ice and older generations of flood? I don't think it is that surprising, given that we only have a few precious places to see ice margin material, and even that's a challenge. But the fact that this coulee is south of any ice advance means that we could have multiple generations of floodwater coming directly from the north as opposed to the east in Montana. Pick it up, boy, we're changing gears. This is really what we're doing, and I'm going to flip around now, and I'm really going to race, because I've got a lot of beautiful slides for you as well. Thank you for your energy tonight. I'm really feeling it. I really appreciate it. Good. Okay. Haven't really rehearsed this, but let's try it anyway. This is a zoomed-in place at our case study, Wenatchee. This is the Columbia River, coming in from the north and flowing down to Vantage, and eventually Wallula Gap, and eventually the Pacific Ocean. This is the Wenatchee River, coming in from Stevens Pass and US Highway 2. You've got your bearings now, starting to see it? What's this? Of course, this is Moses Coulee. But you heard what I said at the beginning. I think it's pretty easy to follow this logic, at least I hope it is for you, that there is a much older history to get the Moses River Valley established here. And there are things on this map that are tied to that pre-Ice Age time. And maybe you're just unaware of it as you drive by or hike in that area or whatever. So that's the purpose of this little exercise here. We don't need fancy equipment to do this. George Otis Smith, Israel Russell, Bailey Willis, all folks who were here long before J. Harlan Brett put this chronology together. So you know what we're doing? We're leaving the Ice Age before we go to the slides. We're getting into older stuff. So I don't know if you've already figured it out, but I'm going to quiz you, kind of. I don't know. It'll be a bunch of mumbles when everybody talks together. But I think there are 4 chapters here on this map. An oldest chapter, a slightly younger chapter, and so on. And it's just the Ice Age youngest chapter that we're going to look at here at the very top. So my question to you is, which of these features are from the oldest time, which are older than 16 million years ago? Which of these features are put in place 16 million years ago? Which of the elements of this sketch are from younger than 16? And then do we have anything from the Ice Age on this thing? Okay, all right, that's enough time to think. Let's go. This is quick. The oldest part of the story is only this portion of the map. The Wenatchee River coming in from the west. Let me explain my logic. Long ago, Bailey Willis was the first to figure this out in the 19th century. The Columbia River flows like this through the Cascades to the ocean. The Columbia River is coming out of British Columbia about like that. Willis and others said, can we assume that before the great lava flows of eastern Washington, the German chocolate cake, can we assume before those lavas came out and buried eastern Washington, there was a different drainage pattern? And can we assume that it was a relatively straight shot for the Columbia River from its course that we know up here to its course that we know down here? And can we assume that there was a major dendritic system looking like this? You'll see some professional maps that were done long ago to propose that. Look at this trend of these drainages coming in from the side. This is the oldest chapter. This is older than 16 million years ago. This is before the Columbia River basalt lava flows buried everything. And these trends of these rivers, including the Wenatchee River coming in here from the northwest to the southeast, is from that old time. Erase. Go to the second youngest, confusing. Go to this next thing, 16 million years ago. We're not at the oldest now, but we're the older chapter. That's the Columbia itself. Older. Why is the Columbia River slightly younger than the Wenatchee's path? Here's the answer. Get a different color. 16 million years ago, there are incredible fissure eruptions. Most of you know this story. And intraplate basaltic volcanism starts pouring out of these cracks and starts flowing. Some of those flows making it all the way to the Oregon coast. Some of those flows getting into Idaho. Some of those flows encroaching into the Cascades. And everything is buried in thousands of feet of basaltic lava. And suddenly, the Columbia River, don't use blue, yellow, whatever. The Columbia River gets sent around the margin of that incredible pile of chocolate basalt, that liquid chocolate. And so getting the Columbia set up here is not the olden days part of the Columbia. The Columbia used to be through here, off the map to the right. Are you following me? But it's getting pushed to this location. And so we have oldest and then older. We have no Moses River Valley yet. We have no Moses Coulee yet. We don't have any drainage in this system. This is now just flat and a lunar-like landscape. And we can put Wenatchee here if you want. I just heard somebody ask that. But we have nothing to the east of the Columbia, just a naked basaltic plain as we think of it. Okay, let's move on. Younger than the lavas, we start to develop ridges and dendritic streams flowing away from the ridges. I'll show you an animation that helps with that. This is from the clockwise rotation. So these fissures are done now. This whole system is cold and hard and dead and brown. And now we start rotating the crust in the Pacific Northwest post 16 million years ago, and we start to create the folds of the Yakima Fold Belt, including this guy here. This is the Badger Mountain anticline. So that got kicked off a little bit younger than 16 million years ago. And it's not just the folds, but it's the streams itself. So in other words, there was a stream system here, a Moses River, that got established just before the fold started to grow. And we know that because this drainage is cutting across an anticline. And many of you know that there are anticlines south of Ellensburg where the Yakima River is going through a number of Yakima folds. It's not because the Yakima River punched a hole through them, but it's because the ridges grew on both sides of that river that got established. That river winning over the uplifting ridges is in this younger story. And that pattern continues from northern Oregon all the way up to this Moses Coulee country before those folds die out. So if you're losing it, this is one of the Yakima folds, even though we're way up by Moses Coulee country. And each of these dendritic stream systems are all tied to this younger story. We're gradually draining away from these uplifting ridges. All three of those chapters, oldest, older, and youngest, are long before the Ice Age. The Ice Age starts 2.6 million years ago. And so that means that we had a V-shaped river valley. You want it in cross-section? There was a V-shaped river valley with the Moses River coming down Moses Coulee. When you see photos and images and video clips in just a bit, you'll see as you look up the guts of Moses Coulee, it doesn't look like that. It's not a V-shaped river with tributaries coming in gradually. Instead, the Ice Age, whether it's blue or red or both, with the water coming directly across the border from Canada, according to the new paper, creates these amazing coulees like Moses Coulee. But the point is, Moses Coulee is not being created from scratch. Moses Coulee is not just a stray Missoula flood that's deciding to excavate. It's seeking out a major river valley that was there for at least 10 million years, according to this logic here. Does this work for you? This isn't that hard, is it? This just takes horseback, nights around the campfire, sketching out your notes, talking it out with people around you at the camp, disagreeing with somebody else, going out to prove a point, whatever. But this is old school field geology that has been lost among many in recent days. Well, do you recognize it? There's Moses Coulee. Look at how cleanly the Ice Age floods, regardless of the source, cut through that old landscape. We're just lopping off those streams as they approach. And we actually form hanging valleys on both sides of Moses Coulee. Antiquity. So this is the new paper that I'm talking about, published just a few days ago and available to you now. You know these names if you've been following this. Oh, round of applause for these guys. There's a backstory to how these two guys got together. Joel Gombiner from the University of Washington, now working for the Washington Geological Survey, and Jerome Lessman, who is a longtime geology teacher at Vancouver Island University in Nanaimo, British Columbia. They have recently joined forces in many forms, including writing this exciting new paper. I have to say it, why not? Jerome's been trying to publish his subglacial thoughts for a few years, and it hasn't worked. He hasn't gotten through, and so this is a major accomplishment, if nothing for that, to finally get some rogue ideas in print in a very well-respected journal. So, Jerome Lessman, this is for you. The story about Jerome and Joel goes back to 2016, May. So Vic Baker, University of Arizona, well-known Ice Age floods geologist, was leading a multi-day geology field trip. The Geological Society of America, the section meeting was happening in Lewiston, Idaho, I think, or Moscow, can't remember. The point is, I enjoyed a Missoula floods trip, and here we are in Moses Coulee, talking about getting the water into Moses Coulee. What an enigma. How are we going to figure it out? And when you go on these trips, you'll meet a lot of new people, and you see a few people that you've known from past days. Here's Vic Baker. One of his star former students, Lisa Ely, teaches here in town. Many of you know her. She's been in town for 30 years by now. And so we're visiting all of these sites that were familiar to me by this time. But one guy who I'd never met before it felt like he was in the middle of every conversation. Didn't matter who was talking. He was like in the front row, like asking all sorts of questions, but not in a negative way, a very positive, just a lively guy. So I was just drawn to this cat. And that's when I first met Jerome Lessman on this 4-day trip. That's where I also met Joel Gombiner. So the two co-authors that just published this paper didn't know each other at this time. Joel was a brand new PhD student at the University of Washington at the time. Showed up to study under John Stone at the University of Washington. Had just graduated from Columbia. And he's basically this young college kid sitting in the back row of my van asking all sorts of rookie questions, but they were the most provocative questions. He really hadn't thought much about the channeled scablands at that point. We stop at Starbucks and look at these really perplexing deposits, all thinking red, Missoula floods the whole way. And so here's Joel and Jerome not speaking to each other because they don't know each other. You know, it's a big group. But it's the first time that they were in the same place at the same time. Flash forward a few years. Look at the date. Early February of 2020. So the world is about to shut down. And I put together an Ellensburg chapter of the Ice Age Floods Institute with Tom Foster and Carl Oquist going back to 2007. And for 15 years, we were having hosted lectures on campus at Central Washington University, and Carl and I would take turns leading Ice Age Floods field trips. And the last Ice Age Floods Ellensburg chapter talk was Joel. So I kept in touch with Joel and asked him to come over and give this work in progress about Moses Coulee at the time. And so this is this last get-together about a month before the world shut down in the room in our new building, Discovery Hall, on the campus of Central Washington University. It turns out that's the last time we ever did one of these. And it's a turning point for me because I haven't done any of these since, and it looks like the chapter's trying to get started again, but I'm stepping away, and I think Carl Loquist is going to keep going with that sort of thing. So this month, we all remember the days leading up to the pandemic. This was, I didn't know it at the time, but like a chapter closing for me personally. But that guy in his 30s was inspirational. He was talking about some new ideas. Speaking of people in their early 30s, and also inspirational, a few days later in that same month, Hannah Shamloo is. Here's this amazingly talented young woman interviewing in our humble little Central Cowpie State University. How are we going to get her here? We managed to convince her to come, and she is great. And so she has replaced some of that energy, and so I'm building for the future with Hannah and her partner, Jordan. So there's a lot of good things coming for our department, and she's the new face of the department, among many others. Okay, a few weeks later, you know what happens, right? We're all stuck at home. There's old Blackie. So, So maybe that's where many of you come into the story. Maybe you meet me for the first time because we're all trapped at home and we're doing these 5 nights a week. But guess who was watching most of those and in the live chat and starting to do study groups on Facebook and other things with Nancy Holtquist and others? So Jerome, I kept in touch with as well, and this online thing, this YouTube thing, Jerome just kept bubbling up as a bigger and bigger behind-the-scenes person, and then we tried to do things on camera. I was not talking about the Ice Age floods. I was talking about the Eocene and exotic terrains, and Jerome was up for about anything. And I just kept coming back to that guy because he was so good, a collaborator, an inspiring guy. So, October of 2021, he invited me to join him on a glacial geology field trip. I'm like, yeah, if I can get across the border, it's still a bit of an issue, but if I can get across the border with my mask and everything, I'll get across. I did. And so I spent 4 nights on a glacial weekend geology trip with Jerome and his students from Vancouver Island University and learned an incredible amount just across the border in the Okanagan and the Okanagan Trench. And of course, we're talking about Moses Coulee left and right. And so I start making videos with Jerome. I'm filming him on his field trips, more field trips, that same weekend. Then the next, a few months later, I forget, we hook up in Omak. We start getting his radical ideas on camera. He's like, I'm over 50. I'm just going to say what I want to say. I can't publish my stuff, so let's go. I don't know who's going to watch this thing. Follow-up interviews, and so on. So that relationship kind of blossomed because of the pandemic in a weird way. It was accelerated for sure. Then just last spring, it's like, you're on sabbatical, come on down. Why don't you teach some of my classes, and I'll film it, and we'll be experimental, and we'll do live streams from the classroom. So much of what I've talked about tonight and introduced you to has already been discussed ad nauseum, probably, on the YouTube channel, and he's directly influencing our students, some of whom are here in the room tonight. This summer, going out on my own then and reading the old Brett's material with many of you in the live community. We're reading the papers together. Each of these, if you see the emblem there, the YouTube logo, that means there's a full video for you to fall asleep to. So, looking at Brett's talus slopes and everything else, going back to Jerome, and then this past winter, some of you are aware, and some of you were actively involved. This past winter, we did 26 episodes, A to Z, the Ice Age floods, and Jerome was on 4 of them. He was just so good and so up for kind of in-the-moment discussion and answering live questions, I just couldn't stay away from the guy. He is meticulous, he's well-read, and he's also imaginative. And in my opinion, mirrors perfectly his former mentor, John Shaw, who I've never met and is no longer with us. But he's following this Canadian point of view and trying to get the Canadians and the Americans to talk to one another. Well, cue the American. So here's Joel, the kid who just did his talk right before the pandemic. I was like, Joel, how's that? Calling him up 2 years later, how's that going? Can I get you on camera? Well, I don't know. Like, I haven't finished my dissertation yet. I don't really know if I should say that. Oh, come on. Can I just ask you a few questions? Can I go up and see one of these channels that you're mapping? I guess so, but I'm going to choose my words carefully. I don't have my PhD yet. So he was rather, reserved in that first video. Invited him back to the auditorium shortly after that, gave a talk last winter. More loose, finished the PhD, let's go, let's talk about these tunnel channels and so on. He is also a very inspiring young person who's on top of his game. So he was involved this past winter. So all I'm getting to is there's a background to why these two cats started working together. And I was trying to basically be a matchmaker. And eventually kind of got them together in the field with Brian Atwater just this past fall up at Grand Coulee. And so there was now, for the first time, a synergy between the three of them. And Atwater turned out to be the main advisor of Joel Gombiner as he finished up his PhD. These videos, Perturbations, Brian Atwater, Jerome Lessman, Joel Gombiner, talking openly about our topics tonight. How much is red? How much is blue? Was Brett's way off? Should we go back and revisit some of Brett's ideas? This is the guy I was talking about last night, Brian Atwater. Okay, we get it. So to finish up the Ice Age floods part of this and the series, yes, we got Sky Coulee, who's in the back of the room, combined with these other two guys, and these roundtable discussions got us to where we are today in the discussion, and it's mostly just an interest in looking back to that original work by Bretz and Flint and others. The TAF. Let's go back into the days of yesterday as we continue with these slides. Here's a map drafted to show the pre-lavas drainage. I don't know if you like it or not, but can you see that original straight shot of the Columbia? Willis had the first idea, but this was redrafted by a guy named Joseph McMacken, who was a teacher just down the hall from Thomas Large at Lewis and Clark High School in Spokane. Vicissitudes of Spokane River in late geologic times by McMacken. So that was our first chapter, if you followed the last part of the chalkboard. Bring in the lavas, please. Bring in the lavas. 300 separate lava flows, sometimes flowing over the Vantage sandstone or other sedimentary interbeds. A more accurate map of the locations of the Columbia River basalt fissures that started to open up, tied to when the Yellowstone mantle plume was a little bit more close to our neighborhood. The fissures are looking like this, similar to Iceland on a smaller scale today. This is pre-Ice Age, you know that. This is 16 million years ago, but these lavas are stacked one on top of another. They are a major player. And those lavas, each one of them was this lunar-like landscape, like in Hawaii today, after a recent eruption, but then there's time to establish a forest, to establish an ecosystem after each one of those lavas. Today, the Ice Age floods have dug in, but we can see that rather coherent basaltic lava flow story. And when you're walking on top of columns and then you are missing a bunch of columns, you know it's an Ice Age flood story to remove many of those columns. You can restore those lava flows in your mind and go to places like right across the river at Vantage to get on top of many of those flows. That's the 16 million year old time. This is long before Moses Coulee or even the Moses River Valley got established. All right, we get it. 3 miles thick in the middle. Too many basalt photos. Move on. There's our friend the Columbia then that is pushed to the base of the Cascades, especially during the Grand Ronde time, the biggest, fattest basalt flows. So now we are getting the Columbia for the first time to Wenatchee, and it's still at Wenatchee. Places down here, the Columbia has worked its way back towards the center of the cake. But during those initial major Grand Ronde eruptions 16 million years ago, that moat has been established around the edge of the lavas. That's not an accident that you have a major geologic contact, basalt on one side, very much older bedrock on the other side. There, the river's working its way back. Okay, but that's not the end of the story. We got to make the ridges. We have to start establishing the Moses River pathway and the Moses River Valley. We do that folding by the clockwise rotation. And this basaltic plain now has these beautiful wrinkles in it, and each wrinkle is 1,000 feet above its base. You recognize Ellensburg and Yakima and the names of each of these ridges. The rivers, the major rivers got established, and then the knuckles rise on both sides in response to clockwise rotation of the Pacific Northwest crust. Northern Washington is not rotating, and so we can squeeze the crust and warp it in response to this ongoing clockwise rotation. It's still happening today. This is maybe the best animation, which didn't cost that much money for one of the PBS episodes. This is the Yakima River Canyon, but it could very well be, if we straighten it out, it could very well be the Moses River and the uplifting Badger Mountain anticline. And instead of the major ridges, maybe you can start noticing all these cute little dendritic guys getting established. As we rise that ridge, we start to drain away from that uplifting ridge. So that was an afterthought animation thrown in. They said, we got $500 left. What do you want? And I'm like, when you try that, it's like, this is way more useful than the Dry Falls thing. So we can see it now. Can you see it? That's a pre-Ice Age signature. Those streams forming away from uplifting ridges, that's the eye that was developed by Israel Russell and others on horseback more than 100 years ago. That is clearly a pre-Ice Age landscape. And so if we go back to the Moses Coulee map, now your eye hopefully is drawn to the ridges and the wrinkles, and we're establishing that pre-Ice Age landscape. And then again, like a hot knife coming through and carving right through, yes, the Ice Age floods. Starting 2.6 million years ago, almost certainly not all younger than 20,000 years ago. My God, look at that. All right, so video from the Coulee itself to show the scope and how this does not look like a river valley any longer. Interesting color choice for the shirt. Subliminal messaging. This is one of the episodes we filmed for the PBS episodes on television, and I want you to notice all the talus, all the broken rock that has fallen down the slopes. Bretts, at least in the early 1920s, thought that the height and the width of that talus field said something about the age of the Ice Age floods coming through. Those talus fields, he eventually gave up on or got attacked too strongly by his critics because of math, physics, other things. But those talus fields were a major attention draw for Bretts back in the early few summers that he was out here. There's another excellent YouTube channel. Bruce Bjornstad has a whole series of wonderful drone-based videos, one that's been watched many, many times on Moses Coulee. Okay, Joel Gombiner giving us this custom-made map. We now know what Moses Coulee looks like. Can we get to something a little bit more fresh? Can we dig into this paper? It's only a 4-page paper. It's short by design, and it's available for you to read. At the end of this talk, I'll show you how to get to it so that you can snuggle up with it tonight in your hotel room. There's Joel and Jerome working together. These are the maps crafted by these fellows, and here is our radial pattern of tunnel channels. That's the interpretation. And so all I want you to notice is that we don't have an isolated Moses Coulee anymore if we have these connecting channels in light blue that are heading north. They're not oriented towards Montana. They're oriented north, the Great White North. Beautiful, undocumented until last week in print, feeding to Moses Coulee. And this is Grand Coulee we were talking about last night with walking with Brian Atwater and him saying, you know, the simplest explanation, Nick, is that the Grand Coulee was carved long before the Missoula floods. Is that the story for each of these coulees? Were there eventually, if these tunnel, okay, hang on. If each of these tunnel channels in that radial network is from blue time, was there a family of tunnel channels at the head of each of our major coulees and channels older than 100,000 years ago? And are those buried or beveled off by younger erosion? How much of an albatross is this if we now have a plateau with tunnel channels leading to it? If we're comfortable with that idea, can we then somehow find mimics of the Moses Coulee and tunnel channel story further east or even further west with the Georgia Strait Trench and the Puget Lowland? Some of those channels, they're not major, they're not as big and deep and thick and wide as Moses Coulee itself, but they're cutting across the Waterville Plateau. They're deeper when they cut through basalt. They're shallower when they cut through non-basalt. So we're up at the edge of the cake, the German chocolate cake now. So some of those tunnel channels are cut into crystalline rocks, granites and metamorphic rocks. But if you squint, you can see a stamp of Ice Age floodwater. But the key is, it's under the ice. It's in the dark. All from the brand new paper by Joel and Jerome. Google Earth by Glenn, email about 2 hours ago from his Airstream in the KOA campground in Ellensburg, says that this might be helpful tonight. We've got the tunnel channels from the new paper, and we have Brett's poking around. 1952, 1929, 1923. We've got Brett's at every green. These are the field notes that are available for you to read. You can read his notes, his thoughts. You can see his sketches. Brett's was a subglacial cat, and he was sniffing around this area multiple years. North of the Coulee, south of the Coulee, north of the Waterville Plateau, up to the Omak Trench, back down in the Grand Coulee, over to another flood pathway. Moses Coulee crossing the Sunset Highway, Moses Coulee East Bar. All those field relations have worked out. All those field relationships worked out 100 years ago by this master, by this brilliant fellow. Why are we just ignoring all of that work? Most of the modern geologists that I know who love the Ice Age floods and even do work in it have not read these Brett's papers. They've literally said, why would I read those old papers? They're old and dusty. Be nice if we got back to some of that. There you go, man. So, finishing this out, looking at some old photos, adding some narratives. Oh, Dry Falls. Some of you were up at Dry Falls, maybe for the first time recently. Cheryl, a live viewer, reference librarian who worked a career at Pullman and then moved in retirement up to Spokane, said, I got a discovery for you. You might be interested. I found this article from September of 1928, and in this periodical, they have photos and a detailed account of the grand opening of Dry Falls State Park on the hottest day of the summer in 1928. The grand opening. I'm going to read some of it to you. I'm not going to read the whole article, but the detail is so amazing, and especially if you've been here all 3 nights, you know some of these characters by now. Written in September. Think back to July 25th, 1928, that day when the weatherman took the top hatch off Hades and mercury came close to its boiling point. Come with me to Ephrata, Washington. It was 4:30 a.m., and thermometers had just begun to simmer quietly. I was asleep. Then came a giant pounding on the door. Time to get up and meet the 3rd annual excursion of the Geological Department of Princeton University. Princeton at the time was loading up their geology students, taking a train trip across the country, arranging field excursions from the train depots, and Dry Falls was on the itinerary 3 summers in a row. The whole hotel in Ephrata was astir with drivers of the cars. So volunteers from Spokane, Ellensburg, George Beck, a longtime professor here, was there that day to help carpool all these Princeton kids and be part of the Dry Falls celebration. The drivers of the cars were to carry 23 geology professors and students from England, Canada, and the United States through the Grand Coulee that J. Harlan Bretz of Chicago University could prove something or other to do with Lucille Hills, erratics, and glaciation. The beat reporter wasn't quite following what Bretz was talking about, I don't think. Across the street in Ephrata, we found the cafe, which promised breakfast at 5 o'clock, would not be ready until 5:15, so we joined the group in the street, some trying to knock the remains of sleep with cigarettes, others paced up and down, trying to talk as if they got up every morning at that hour. Some were backing their cars out of the garage. Then Armstrong, chief arranger of the delegation which represented Spokane, Pullman, Ellensburg, and Walla Walla, came up with the announcement that the train with the Princeton students in it was 4 hours late, and surprisingly, nobody complained. They were all good sports about it. Dr. Bretz, a student who was with him, and Thomas Large, high school teacher from Spokane, arrived after having slept in their bedrolls on the courthouse lawn in Ephrata. A conference was held, plans carefully made and remade because part of the highway was to be run, had to be oiled that morning at 8 o'clock. All the cameras in the party came out for pictures on their field trip. And while the last were being snapped, a train whistled in the distance, and there was a rush for the cars, everyone feeling that perhaps the train had made up time and arrived. But after a hurried and dusty trip back to Stratford, there was another wait for almost another hour before the Limited roared to a stop and the Princeton party unloaded. You know where Stratford is? It's a dinky little ghost town of almost a place. It's got a little community, but just to the east of Soap Lake. The Princetonites in overalls, they were a motley crew here and there. A prof in khaki hiking clothes and wide hats strode among the students, some of whom were dressed in overalls and blue denim shirts. Others wore tan shirts and golf knickers. Everyone carried a camera. It's 1928, man, modern times. A notebook and a handpick. They quickly climbed into cars, which they'd been assigned, and we were finally off to run to Coulee City. At the high spot of that road, the caravan stopped and the arguments started. That is Dr. Bretz beginning his talks to the students on the formation of the Coulee. This is Grand Coulee, not Moses Coulee. And Dr. Jones of the Canadian Geological Service did not entirely agree. We pulled into the grounds at Dry Falls, laid out for the dedication of the state park a little before noon. It was 110 degrees. A tent had been erected on the edge of the great chasm of the Fossil Waterfall 3 miles southwest of Coulee City. Hundreds of people were on hand for the ceremonies in spite of the blistering sun. The arrangements for the dedication had been made by Harry Young, State Superintendent of Parks. Well did we appreciate the lunch and more, the ice water, lemonade, and tea, which the women provided. Mr. Field of Chelan arose to begin the ceremony, started lunch. We had to be on our way at 1 o'clock. Rufus Woods of Wenatchee talked to the State Department, then Dr. Bretz on the Coulee Formation, finally Frank McCann of Coulee City. The Methow Valley Girls, a group of high school students with their booster song, "There Ain't No Flies in the Methow," delighted the geological students from every part of the globe. Before the completion of the program, the caravan again went this way into the great rock-walled canyon, the cars strung out for several miles, each one leaving behind a long plume of dust. It goes on, but the point is, we have photos from that day. Thanks to some very forward-thinking magazine folks, newspaper folks, this is Bretz. This is Bretz holding court in 110 degrees. That's Thomas Large right behind him. I've studied these photos since February to really make sure of this. I've gotten good quality of these photos from this State Historical Society in Spokane. Thank you to that gentleman for providing these to me free of charge. Bretz on the left, the Princeton students and others. They haven't even finished the roof on the Vista House, and some of you know that, in the Dry Falls parking lot. And they're all huddled together for a group photo. Bretz is here. McCann is to his left. Thomas Large is off on the right. After reading all of these field notes and trying to imagine these people, it does feel like stepping back in time, almost exactly 100 years ago, thanks to this photographer. This is the guy, Frank Gilbert, based out of Spokane. There's a whole Frank Gilbert collection of photos at this historical society. Amazing photos from this guy. Maybe just a hobby photographer, I'm not sure. This is from Kettle Falls, one of Frank's photos. So from that article that Cheryl put together and found for us and sent to me and I shared with the live crew this winter, I had these pimply photos from that PDF that Cheryl sent me. So then I went to the live viewers and said, does anybody know how to spruce up photos? And so a whole number of viewers used AI and other programs and pet things to spruce up their photos to really give us a good look at some of these pictures. Here's an original photo from Cheryl. Here's after some of the smoothing and other stuff I know nothing about. But it's been fun to get a new look on some of these kind of are impressionistic here of Bretz and Armstrong from Spokane. This is a favorite photo taken by Frank in the Grand Coulee with the Model Ts or whatever cars those are. Same idea. Can somebody spruce them up? And Ken, one of the viewers, used AI to put in sky and colorized and other things. So more contributions from the viewer community. Brett started working that same summer, 1928, with a city slicker in New York City, Isaiah Bowman. And Bowman was in charge of the American Geographical Society. They had money, and Bretz, we have all the letters, Bretz convinced Bowman to create this map, published in 1928. A major boon then and a major boon now. This is the one I showed you last night that was so accurately done, overlaid on Google Earth. Look what Bretz is telling us. Moses Coulee is here. This is in 1928 now. He has a margin of the red ice with a solid line. He has an approximate dashed line for the Spokane Glacier, which advanced before the Wisconsin Glacier. So he runs Moses Coulee up underneath a more recent ice advance. And in truth, there is a beautiful, graceful moraine from red time that's draped on both sides and right across the floor of Moses Coulee, north of US 2. So from last night, this older, bigger story in blue and younger, smaller story holds true in Moses Coulee and other places as well. New York City, maps. 1920s, we come to a close with Bretz. He never comes back, except for one field season a few decades later. But before he comes back, he convinces Bowman again to come through. And maybe you've seen this publication. You haven't seen this. These are sketches that Bretz from his office in Chicago is taking stationery off of his desk, freehand, detailed maps of the area south of Dry Falls and saying, Bowman, I need a good book now with good illustrations about the Grand Coulee, next door to Moses Coulee. And so this beautiful, high-priced publication was on display for then and still now, published in 1932. Looking down on Steamboat Rock. Air photos, 1932. Bretz saw air photos. That's not true that he never saw the area from airplanes. He at least had someone to go up and take beautiful photographs. These maps again, coming through in living color from 1932. An amazing set of landforms just to the east of Grand Coulee and Moses Coulee, a similar story not very far away. You remember Thomas from Seattle, who personally delivered a bunch of old Richard Foster Flint maps and scientific papers. Flint, in the 1930s, the main critic of Bretz, took this map out to the field every summer. The evidence is it's all folded and tattered, and there's all sorts of chicken scratch. Flint, writing, Aaron Waters believes the Telford track is younger than the Cheney track. Flint scratching Otis Freeman's old drift must be here at the head of Moses Coulee. But Flint was the guy that never believed that there were catastrophic floods of water. Flash forward into the 1940s, World War II era, 1950s. I'm ahead of myself. Here's more Frank photos from Dry Falls, maybe in the 30s. You can maybe recognize the vintage of the car there. 40s possibly. Finally, Brett comes back. There's new exposures by building the Grand Coulee Dam. And thanks to Google Earth by Glenn, we have a whole new round of thumbtacks from his field notes. J. Harlan Brett's one last field season, a month worth of investigations in the summer of 1952. Now Brett's is in his 70s. He's not getting around maybe as well as he did before, but he is still full of energy. And yet another beautiful map. You know what he has? He still has the Spokane ice sheet over Spokane. He still is peddling the Spokane flood as a major story. And our topic today, Spokane ice sheet over in Spokane, the flood paths coming away from that. And our topic today, Moses Coulee, heading right for the ice sheet. Why would you look at that and think anything else than water came out from under the ice? Isn't that the most logical interpretation of that map relationship? Seems like it is to me. J. Hoover Mackin taught glacial geology at the University of Washington, and in that field season of 1952, Brett was communicating regularly with Mackin and sharing ideas and bouncing ideas back and forth with him. Mackin had all sorts of ideas, and it's not an accident that Mackin was in agreement or willing to communicate with Brett. Remember, Brett was still an outcast. Even in 1952, nobody was addressing his work. Kind of like today. Nobody was reading those papers. He was just this crackpot. So there were just a few allies, including this guy Hoover Mackin. Why was Mackin receptive to Brett? Mackin went to Harvard, and he was a student of William Morris Davis. And in the 1920s, the early 1920s, Davis drove up the Grand Coulee after reading those very early papers by Brett's and ideas by Brett's. And he was an early enthusiast of Brett's idea. It took a lot of guts. So Davis trained Mackin. Now Mackin is dealing with Brett's directly in 1952. I managed to get some some classroom notes from a glacial geology class taken in fall of 1947. And these are the classroom notes of George Beck, who was a longtime geology professor here. He was a music professor hired to teach cello and band and orchestra, but this is the guy that also founded and played a large role in developing the Ginkgo Petrified Forest State Park. So George Beck's grandson is with us tonight, and grandson George, yes. There's grandson George. There's grandson George who's with us tonight, and here's his granddad, George Beck. But Beck went back to school midlife to get geology degrees so that he could teach and keep a job in both music and geology here at the college in Ellensburg. So we can go back to the 20s with George Beck, not J. Harlan Brecht now, but George Beck, the guy who lived in Ellensburg. And he's up on Steamboat Rock with his students. So he was taking people up to look at the Ice Age floods. No evidence that he was talking about Brett's and the weird ideas that Brett's had back then. But George Beck, the guy that investigated the Blue Lake Rhino and investigated all sorts of petrified wood collections in the area, continued to be a long-time geology professor here based out of Ellensburg. And we're back to those notes. Again, George Beck is going to retire in 1959, so this is just a decade earlier. But I'll read this for you. J. Hoover Mackin is teaching his classes in 1947 in Seattle. He's talking about pre-Wisconsin deposits. He's talking about the Waterville Plateau. He's talking about glacial deposits south of Spokane. So there were supporters of Brett's wild ideas and even being taught in university classes in the 1940s. Here's our aprons of outwash along the margin of an advancing ice front. It's comforting to see some of these classrooms were looking ahead and being open. Thank you, J. Hoover Mackin, for that. We finished tonight with my favorite letter out of all of the Brett's letters that were saved by J. Harlan Bretz himself. And this is late in life. Aaron Waters, in retirement years, writing a letter, handwritten letter, to J. Harlan Bretz in the 1970s. So now Bretz is just about to get his Penrose Medal right before he passes away. Aaron Waters, it's almost too perfect. Aaron Waters, who taught at Johns Hopkins and in Santa Barbara, grew up in Waterville, on the Waterville Plateau. His name is Aaron Waters. He liked studying Ice Age floods, made of water. Okay, we get it. So here's September 1978. I'm going to read the whole letter if you don't mind. It's just a beautiful letter. Dear J. Harlan, thank you very much for sending a copy of the Vic Baker fine book on the Scablands, 1978. It is nice to see that they give credit where credit is due to the man who walked the very hundreds of miles and made the countless accurate observations that put the whole thing together. Today, with astonishing satellite pictures, 1978, abundant and paved roads and outstanding cuts made by the dam builders, irrigation engineers, and road builders, the documentation they have given was easy to get. Not so when you engaged in the hard physical labor that made your documentation possible. To me, as a country kid who grew up on the Waterville Plateau, it is a delight to see that this later work, supported by floods of NASA and NSF dollars, and supplemented by photographs, maps, and ease of travel, has done little to document, but a great deal to confirm your hypothesis. And that you offered, equipped with little more than a pair of sturdy legs and a particularly agile and observing mind. Dollars and what they buy are never equivalent to what a brilliant mind and determination will do. Yours is the glory, and I salute you. Best wishes, Aaron Waters. Bretz was brilliant, and he passed the baton on to a young Vic Baker in the 1970s. And now Vic Baker and Richard Waite are old men, and it's time to pass the baton on to a new crop of interested, youthful, energetic, and creative geologists. I'm hoping that it happens in the next few years. We can all cross our fingers and encourage as much work as possible. With Moses Coulee, with the Grand Coulee, with many other spots in mind. If you want to get your hands on the brand new paper, as well as all these documents we've been talking about in these lectures this spring, go to nickzentner.com, click on either the word Bretz or floods. If you go to floods, you'll see at the very top of the list the brand new paper by Joel Gombiner and Jerome Lessman. The paper looks like this. It's so exciting to see it finally happen between these two very fine and bright people. And so we look back 2 nights ago to our first lecture here in the auditorium, what happened to the Spokane ice sheet. The following night, which was last night, Bretz's Spokane flood and the Missoula floods, and the wrap-up tonight. The end of the trilogy was Moses Coulee carved by subglacial floods. I'd like to thank all of you for attending tonight, and a special thanks to all the people who were part of the live stream series this past winter. And representing that vast group of international people, these folks in particular spent far more time than all of us, maybe me, in putting those programs together. They're all with us tonight. Glenn, would you stand up, please? Sharon, would you stand up? Jody, would you stand up? Thomas, would you stand up in Seattle? Thanks to you guys for all of your effort. There they are. Looking good, you guys. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thank you. We'll see you next spring. Good night. Thank you.